It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
We'll jump right into it. So we're 4 days away from the election. In the last few months, we've seen an alarming rise of political violence, including one of the major party presidential candidates suggesting that former Representative Liz Cheney be shot just in the past 24 hours. We've had a sitting president drop out of the race, a historic nominee take his place, 2 assassination attempts, elected officials refusing to certify election results. I could go on. As a historian and a scholar of democracy, can you help us make sense of this moment that we're living through in the US?
Well, thanks for that easy question to start with. I feel that making sense of this moment requires a lot more than me offering you a glib answer. So I won't try to give you one. I think what I'll do instead is begin by stepping back a little bit. If any of you know a little bit about me and my work, I actually spent the first part of my career writing history books. I wrote about the history of the Soviet Union and of Eastern Europe. I lived part of the time in Eastern Europe. I have a home in Poland. My husband's Polish. I go back and forth between Poland and the US. Of course, I grew up here and I'm American. But for me, I spent the 90s, the 2000s, doing research on a political system that I thought would never come back. So I wrote a history of the Gulag. This is of the Soviet concentration camp system. I wrote a history of the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and I sketched out how it had happened, what kinds of institutions had to be destroyed one by one by the Soviet, by the Red Army and by the NKVD, which was there, what was the KGB was called at that time, in order for autocracy, for totalitarianism to take hold. And all the time when I was doing that, I thought I was writing about the distant past. More recently, starting in about 2014, starting with the Russian invasion of Crimea, I began to understand that I wasn't writing about the past, I was writing about things that are coming back. And so I know it's always somehow awkward and uncomfortable to see one's country as part of something bigger, and Americans in particular, we like to think that we're exceptional and unique. But we are living through an era of really extraordinary democratic breakdown in many countries, and the rise of a network of autocracies who are pushing very hard against democracy in many places. I've seen it in Europe. We've experienced it in Poland. We see the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a part of it. The Russian disinformation that's in our political system that maybe some of you know about or have run into on social media, that's another piece of it. There are now, unlike the 1990s, there are now dedicated people, both inside our country and around the world, who are focused on undermining democracy, on empowering and promoting extremism of different kinds, actually. And we are a part of that system. And some of the chaos that we feel isn't unique to us. I mean, maybe it makes you feel better to know that other people feel the same way. And in Germany, where I was a couple of weeks ago, or in France, or in the Netherlands. We're living through a moment when a lot of norms are being questioned, and when particularly it's true that the form of communication that we use, the way in which we get and process information, the little clips that we see on our phones, the short bursts of information that we get, sometimes we don't know where they come from. This is leading people in a direction where politics become more emotional, more angry. There's less time for reflection. There's less time for conversation or for compromise. For looking for people to come together. And that's something that's happening not just here, but everywhere. And so before we go into the details of our particular election, I thought I would step back and say that.
A really helpful starting point. Looking at Tuesday, how consequential and important do you think this election is? We are a country that has heard for multiple presidential elections, and it's the most important of our lifetime. This one does truly feel that way. But give us a perspective, as someone who's observed elections in other countries. What's the moment we have on coming up here in the U.S.?
What's consequential about this election is the profound difference in the vision of the country that's on offer on both sides, and the language that's being used on both sides. I don't think we've ever had, maybe since 1860, I don't remember it, I don't think even you guys do, and maybe that felt just as divisive. But I can't think of another election in modern American history that does, where we have, on the one hand, Kamala Harris's final, her final major rally was held in Washington, surrounded by American flags, with the White House in the background, and she spoke about writing another chapter in the American story. She spoke about the traditions of the country, bringing them into the future. Former President Trump's his major final rally was in Madison Square Garden, where he had a series of speakers over 6 hours who were from all kinds of different places. They were comedians, there was a Scientologist, there were a couple of billionaire friends of his who described, I won't actually repeat all the vulgar language that was used. They described their political opponents as garbage or as idiots or stupid. Or Harris was described by Tucker Carlson as Samoan Malaysian, which I think was an allusion to her mixed race heritage. And you had a vision of America in crisis, in chaos. America's a catastrophe, America's a disaster, America's unrecognizable. And that I think is the vision that not half the country, maybe not even 30% of the country, but the people around Donald Trump have. And because you have those two different visions, you have very different language being used, and you have very different kinds of campaigns are being run. What's at stake? A German politician said to me a few months ago. He said, "We might wake up one morning and discover that we," and he meant Germany, but he also meant all of Europe, are facing 3 dictatorships, or 3 autocracies was the word he used. Russia, China, and the United States. That they're afraid that the direction that we could head in would be so hostile to our traditional allies and to our traditional values as to be unrecognizable. I'm repeating to you what outside observers see when they look at the election. So we have this choice between a continuation of the political system, flawed though it is, but with the values that we know at its heart, and something that we don't know, but could be radically different.
Your latest book, Autocracy, Inc., really focuses on this new class of dictators, autocrats around the world, and the unlikely teaming up alliances that they've made. How do you think they are thinking about this election?
So one of the things that I describe in the book is the way in which a very different group of autocracies, we're talking about communist China and nationalist Russia and theocratic Iran and whatever North Korea is, and Bolivarian socialist Venezuela. These are very, very different political systems with different ideologies. They do have one thing in common, which is that all of them are led by whether individuals or political parties or elites who would like to rule without political opposition, without the rule of law, without independent judges, without independent media. They don't want any checks and balances. They want to be absolute rulers. They are different kinds and they have different goals. And more recently, and this is one of the themes of the book, they've come to understand that in order to do that, they need to push back against their political opponents and the language that their opponents use. And the language that their opponents use is about not just democracy, but the rule of law, transparency, accountability, rights, human rights. And that in order to maintain power, they need to undermine those things wherever they are. So they undermine them at home, they undermine them around the world. They will rescue one another when they see they're in trouble or under challenge from those ideas, and they will also seek to undermine democratic countries and democratic alliances where they can. So for them, the success in the United States of a political leader who has already once sought to overturn the result of an election, who uses violent and dehumanizing language about his opponents, who expresses scorn for the rule of law, for judges, for the media. Whatever their views of Trump or Harris or their particular policies, the success of someone like that is good for them, for all of them, because it contributes to the appearance and feeling of democratic decline, which is something that they need to maintain their own power. So they need to defeat their own opposition internally, whether it's the women's movement in Iran, or whether it's the anti-corruption movement in Russia, or whether it was the Hong Kong Democrats in China. They need to undermine them, and so for them, any failure of democracy or any evidence that democracy doesn't work is good for them. I mean, these are all countries who, to one degree or another, have sought in their own countries to build a kind of autocratic narrative. And that means to argue that autocracy and dictatorship are stable and safe, and democracy is divided and weakened and unsuccessful. And that's part of how they stay in power. But they promote this narrative everywhere, including in our country. I mean, we see it in our social media, including in Europe. You can see it there, and including through their actions. I mean, one of the purposes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, aside from Putin's imperial ambitions and so on, one of the purposes was to demonstrate to the Russians that Ukrainian democracy would fail. Because if you remember, there was a democratic revolution there in 2014. They replaced an autocratic leader with a popularly elected one. In the wake of that happening, the Russian leadership became afraid that this model, this change, might become appealing to Russians, and so they needed to show that democracy fails, and that was one of the reasons for that invasion. So anything that looks to them like a failure here, they see as positive. And whether they like or dislike a particular leader or his or her particular policies, I think is less important.
I want to transition over to one of this is a core part of the mission at Democracy First, which is building a cross-partisan pro-democracy movement, and that it is essential in a democracy to have multiple parties that believe in these core tenets. When we were just talking before this, I was reminded that earlier in your career, some would call you a conservative or an anti-communist. Talk to us about the historic role and the necessity, if you believe it is necessary, of having that cross-partisan coalition of people of different political ideologies that are united into preserving the rules of democracy that it can continue.
Well, we've had that in this country at least since the Civil War. I mean, we can agree that the Civil War was a moment of disagreement when we didn't agree about what the rules would be. And although there's been transformation, and the country is very different now than it was before, and there have been huge upheavals, the civil rights movement, and so on, there has been an agreement about what some of the core values of the country are. Not just the Constitution, but there's the rule of law, the belief that there is a set of rules, and you are elected by those rules, and and of course there's a way in which democracy requires something that's almost superhuman in it. It means that when you win office, you have to preserve the system, keep everything in place, so that your political enemies can beat you 4 years from now, right? And if you lose, you have to say, okay, I'm going to let my political enemies rule, but 4 years from now, I'm going to get the chance to win again. And that's actually that's harder to maintain. I mean, I've seen countries where it's broken down, and of course it could break down here. But it was maintained here by our reverence for our Constitution, which flawed those aspects of it may be, by our reverence for our history, for the ideas of the founding fathers, and again, even at some of the most difficult and divisive moments of history. Think about the language of the civil rights movement. Think about the language of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King used he used the language of the Constitution to make his argument for civil rights. So he was someone who was acting within the American tradition. And we've always been able to do that by having this cross-party consensus about what the rules are. If you think about other places, I live, as I have said, part of the time in Poland, where we had 8 years of an autocratic populist government from 2015 until last October, who won an election legitimately, and as has happened in many other places, nevertheless, when they took power, began to try to undermine the institutions of democracy rather than preserving them. They politicized the courts. Their equivalent of the Supreme Court. They changed its membership illegally. It's as if somebody abolished the Supreme Court and put in 9 new judges overnight, which, let's agree wouldn't be popular if that happened here. And the way they were ultimately defeated last October was through a coalition of political groups who previously hadn't been on the same side. So a center-left party, a center-right party, and a liberal party came together, agreed that one of the central issues was restoring democratic values, was restoring the rule of law, and they won the election that way. So you can see that in, not just that the need to maintain that coalition, the need to maintain that, those very difficult rules does sometimes require a pretty broad group. So yeah, I think in this country, Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals and progressives, whatever name you give yourself, we can find some unity in agreeing on what the rules are and agreeing on the spirit of abiding by the spirit of our Constitution.
In thinking outside of political leaders exclusively, what in civil society, business leaders, corporate leaders, religious leaders, what role do they play, and are you seeing them step up here in the U.S. In a way that's meaningful or in need of more?
Well, business leaders, religious leaders, they're all citizens, just like people who work in grocery stores and drive taxis. One of the mistakes that I think was made in our society, and not only ours, over the last several decades, was the growth of a kind of professional political class, and a feeling that politics was somehow distant, politics happened over there and real life happened over there, and ordinary people don't have anything to do with it. I mean, this was also linked to a sense that we all had that democracy was inevitable. We won World War II and we won the Cold War, and therefore democracy triumphed, and there's nothing in particular that anybody has to do in order to maintain it. I mean, democracy was something like, we assumed it was something like tap water. You turn on the water, you don't think about where it came from, you don't worry about it, it's just there. And democracy had that function. And so ordinary people, business leaders or taxi drivers, didn't really have to involve themselves in it or care about it. And I think one of the things that we've learned in the last several years is that without civic engagement, without ordinary people being involved in their communities, whether they're poll workers or whether they work for a political party or whether they are just involved in community projects, if you don't have that, if people aren't engaged politically, then democracy can decline. That it's a political system that functions best when more people have some engagement. And I wouldn't, of course it matters what that religious leaders and business leaders were involved, but I would go farther than that. I think having, all of us are, aside from whatever else we do, whether we're school teachers or, we work in banks, all of us are citizens, and so all of us have an obligation to the greater community to play some part in understanding how our political system works and being part of it.
Good segue into one of the themes I wanted to connect on, and I think it's in The Twilight of Democracy, your book that came out in 2020, is that right?
Right in the middle of the pandemic, July 2020, that book came out.
And it's on the promise of inevitability. At Democracy First, we do pretty extensive polling and research and focus groups into how the public and electorate are thinking about democracy, the threats that it's under. And one thing that we've realized is it's hard for Americans to think about America without democracy. It is a synonymous idea to them. I had one time a woman said in a focus group that she could pretty clearly see the United States in a violent civil war again, but she couldn't imagine America without democracy. Can you sort of expand on that? What do you mean by the promise of inevitability and the role that it plays in declining democracies?
So let me answer that firstly by saying one of the problems that we all have is we've seen too many movies with Nazis in them, right? So we have an image in our minds of what a dictatorship looks like, right? And it looks like men on the street goose-stepping, right? Yeah. Actually, in the modern world, most democracies don't decline because of a coup d'etat. And most autocracies don't look like Nazi Germany. Instead, what's much more common now is for a leader to be elected legitimately, and for that leader to then come into office and then begin to take apart the institutions of government. So, political scientists call it capturing the state. So, for example, in our country, taking over the Department of Justice, and instead of using the Department of Justice to prosecute people who have broken laws, using it for the personal benefit of the president or the president's party or the president's friends. That would be a break with our tradition. That would be a capturing of that institution. Or, for example, taking the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, using it not to regulate the use of bandwidths and television licenses in this country for the good of most Americans, but doing it in such a way that journalists or others who bothered the president or the ruling party lost their licenses. So in other words, to begin to use the institutions of the state in a partisan political way. To some degree this happens in any administration, but we haven't had, at least in modern history, we haven't had an extreme version of that. I mean, I lived through, as I said, a version of that in Poland. We saw what happened when the state, instead of civil servants being people who are qualified for their particular jobs because they know about water pollution or they know about automobile regulation, whatever it is that they're meant to be doing. Instead of that, the party hired people who were loyal to the party, or in Poland, this is a specific thing, people's cousins, you know. So it was cousins and relatives and brothers-in-law, and that's who was given jobs in the state administration, rather than people who were there to fulfill the law and to make sure that the air is clean and the streets are clean and roads get built and aren't crooked. But that's actually the purpose of the state administration. You know, so the fear is that you know, if too many Americans, like too many Europeans and too many others who live in democracy, assume that democracy is inevitable, you know, as long as we've elected people democratically, then they'll fulfill their job and do what they want. But I think they haven't taken into consideration the possibility that it's not Nazi dictatorship, but that a much less democratic system, a much more corrupt system, and a much more partisan and biased system we could elect that as well. We could choose that whether or not we know that we're choosing it. So there's nothing inevitable about the system that we have now. And remember, most democracies in all of history have not succeeded. Sooner or later, they've all collapsed. And I should say the people who knew that the best were, once again, our founding fathers. When you read what they were talking about when they were writing the Constitution, what most worried them was the rise to power of what Alexander Hamilton called a demagogue, somebody who would undermine the system. And our weird Constitution, including the weirdest thing, which is the Electoral College, was actually created not so that the people of Pennsylvania get to decide who's president, but sorry, but actually the purpose of it was to be a kind of break between the popular vote that they worried might go to a demagogue and the White House. Actually, I spent some time looking at this earlier this year. The Electoral College never worked the way it was supposed to. It never functioned as it was meant to. And I think that at least the first or one of the first presidents who was elected without the popular vote, this is John Quincy Adams, even at the time, this is John Adams's son, even at the time of his election, he was chosen, the Electoral College was tied, I believe, and then he was selected by the House to be president, and he was considered all through his presidency to be an illegitimate president, because people had this sense that if you won the popular vote, and in that year actually it was Andrew Jackson who won it, if you won the popular vote, you should win, and that's 150 years ago. So it's been a problem from the beginning. But the reason for it originally was the founding fathers' fear of someone taking power and changing the system.
And you mentioned this, which is the role of the independent judiciary and the role that it plays in preserving democracy. And I think there have been some alarming indicators from the court's decisions around partisan politics. What role does the judiciary play in maintaining its independence in order to preserve democracy?
So this is something I wrote about actually in The Atlantic a month or two ago. I wrote about where I got interested in where does the idea of an independent judiciary come from, and how old is it, and what did we think it was? And one of the interesting things I found was that during the period of the American Revolution, one of the grievances that the colonists had against the British, or against well, they were all British then, but against the rule, you know, the colonial rule from England, was that was an edict by the king that judges in the colonies were to serve at the pleasure of the king. In other words, they could be dismissed. And this created at the time a kind of, you know, riots and outrage and anger because judges should be independent. And they had this sense even then that the purpose of an independent judge is to be someone who stands for not the ruler, who's not there to enforce the will of a particular person, but who's there to enforce the rule of law. And it has to be said that at almost every juncture in American history where there's turbulence or change, people start becoming anxious about judges. I mean, actually, it happens pretty early on in American history. It happens again at the time of the New Deal. You know, any time of momentous change, you have it. What worries me now, you know, we could go off and have another hour-long conversation about the Supreme Court. Maybe we don't want to do that. But what worries me now is the phenomenon that's arising of judges who are not merely partisan in that they are right-wing or left-wing, or they are originalists, or they are progressives, or it's not just their ideological views, which we can argue about what views a judge should have, but we've had the emergence of a few judges who appear to be personally and politically loyal to the person who appointed them. And this, I'm thinking of Judge Cannon in Florida, who has made several decisions that are way out of line with what other judges have decided, which don't go along with precedent, which have been criticized by other members of the judiciary, and she seems to be doing it in order to help Donald Trump escape a legal case. That's different from being a conservative judge, you know, or having a view about abortion one way or the other, or Roe v. Wade. That's a different phenomenon. And the spread and growth of that kind of judge who, despite the fact, by the way, our judiciary is actually very well protected from political influence. You know, judges are appointed for long periods of time, you know, for life actually, to the federal bench. They are paid independently. Their pay is not, you know, can't be changed by political whim. There's sort of layers built around them. And this was also, by the way, debated in Philadelphia at the time of the Constitutional Convention. You know, so they are protected. They should be protected from political influence. But the fact that we now have a few judges who you can see in the system who, despite that, are acting politically is another new and worrying sign.
How do you think the founding fathers would have interpreted the Supreme Court decision to make the former presidents immune from?
Well, the decision was to make all presidents immune. Right. So that was, I mean, look, you know, George Washington was offered a monarchy. Many people wanted him to be king. Many people, in fact, when he finally left office, mourned the fact that he was leaving. They thought nobody's going to be able to replace him. It was actually one of the problems that John Adams had. You can see I've been spending a lot of time with the Adams family. It was kind of shadow over John Adams, who was our second president. The fact that he wasn't George Washington. But Washington and most of the other authors of the Constitution were very clear that they did not want an imperial presidency. They wanted the president also to be subject to the rule of law. That the president was a citizen, was not in that sense privileged, was not somebody who was somehow above the law or beyond the law. Certainly the president was not, you know, somebody who represented the will of the people or was some kind of mystic embodiment of the American soul. That's an idea that we got later, and you know that is closer to a more 1930s concept of what a leader is. You know, it wasn't somebody who's by his very existence has some significance. The president is important because he's elected, because he's been elected by a set of rules. He then governs according to a set of rules, and then, after 4 years, he's meant to hand back the institutions as he found them, you know, in the same good condition as before, which, as we've already discussed, can be a pretty tough thing to have to do. So I thought the immunity decision was out of line with. Despite the fact that, as I said, it's meant to apply to all presidents. That one wasn't written for a particular president.
You recently wrote in The Atlantic about Donald Trump's increasing use of rhetoric about his opponents that correlates with other authoritarians and dictators from the past. Specifically, the reference, the enemy from within. Can you explain to us what are those historical parallels and why and how autocrats use that violent rhetoric?
So actually the word that caught my attention was the word vermin. Okay, and this is why. So again, I wrote books about Soviet history, and I have a whole section on my computer called Old Notes, right? And I heard the word vermin, and I put in a search term in my thousands of old notes from working in Soviet and East German archives, and I put in the word vermin. And of course I got lots of responses, because vermin was the word that Stalin liked to use, the East German Stasi liked to use. They had a project in the 40s called Operation Vermin, which was meant to clear the area of the border between East and West Germany was meant to be cleared of people who were politically suspect, and those were the vermin. Hitler liked also this kind of language. He talked a lot about parasites. He also talked a lot about poisoning the blood. The Jews are poisoning the blood of our nation. And so when Donald Trump began to talk about immigrants poisoning the blood, and when he talked about, I think it was left-wing radicals who are vermin that need to be, this rang alarm bells in my head. Again, not because I think Donald Trump is Hitler. I don't, just to make that clear. But because first of all, this kind of language is a real break from anything that I could find in previous American history. I actually went back and read George Wallace's speeches. George Wallace was, you'll remember, was a presidential candidate in the 1960s. He was a segregationist. He was the governor of Alabama. Then he ran for president. He made one very famous racist speech in which he says, segregation now, today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And I read the speech, and in that speech, he doesn't use dehumanizing language about anybody. He just, actually the segregationists often sought to present themselves, it was separate but equal and so on. I mean, it hid an uglier ideology, but the language of vermin and parasites and poison blood, this is not something we've ever had. I mean, not in mainstream presidential American politics. And that set off alarm bells, because to me, again, I don't think Trump is Hitler, but he's clearly preparing people. He's preparing his followers for something uglier, something they're not used to. If you speak about your political enemies or about immigrants or about anybody as vermin or parasites, that means not just that they have no rights, they're not even human. It's a way of dehumanizing people, and it's also the extremity of the language, I think, is preparing the population for something. I mean, either if he loses the election, it's a preparation for perhaps another assault on the political system. If he wins the election, it's preparing people for a more extreme form of government than we've known before. I don't think you use language like that by accident. And of course you can find examples of Democrats saying ugly things, and we could argue for a long time about the use of the word garbage and who means what by it. But Trump did start, as I said, it was the specific thing of comparing people to insects that I just don't know of any precedent for it. And because he has continued it, because he, as recently as 24 hours ago, because he imagined Liz Cheney in front of it was a very specific number of guns, because he keeps doing it, it makes me think that it's something that matters to him and that it's part of his policy.
Looking ahead, it can feel like we've been living through one 10-year-long presidential campaign. But looking to the future, if the pro-democracy forces here are elected next week, how do they use that leadership to reconcile the country, to move forward? What have you seen in other countries that can give us some direction in how we come back together after this
I would
period?
return to this idea of coalitions. You know, it's very important that whoever wins or loses, that we continue to try to find unifying language, and that we find it in our history and in our traditions, that we find it in our Constitution, that we find it in practices of the past. You know, those are the ways that we rebuild the country. I would hope that if Harris were to win, that she would have, I can't expect her to have a bipartisan administration, but that she would make gestures to the Republican Party, that she would work with Republicans in Congress, if it's possible at all. I would hope that she would do that. I would hope that Donald Trump would do that, were he to win. You know, right now he's preparing us for something different, so I don't have a lot of expectation, but maybe there would be people around him who would see the need for that. It's you know, also were he to win, it's very important that a coalition of people who care about our ideas and our ideals also remain together, and also remain together and remain vocal about what matters, about maintaining the independence of our courts, about maintaining the rule of law, about maintaining an idea of government which is government for everybody. It's not just government for the people who are in charge. And the laws aren't just made and the rules aren't just made to benefit financially or otherwise the people who are in charge, but they're made to benefit all of us. And it will then be all of our responsibility to make sure that that remains true.
And we're going to open up here. We've got a little bit of time for some questions from the audience, but wanted to close my final question to you, looking at the prospect of and again, this is beyond one candidate. There is a movement that includes many politicians who openly reject the core principles of democracy. It's easy to feel despair and hopelessness after that, but you come, I mean, your husband is the foreign minister of Poland now, and your family has been involved in the reemergence of democracy in Poland and the success of that coalition after a dark period. If you could just leave us with how that was possible, and again, if the election goes a certain way on Tuesday, there's still a future.
No, there's always a future. Never fear. There's always a future. This book is dedicated to the optimists. It's actually a pretty gloomy book, and almost everybody who interviews me about it says, "Wow, who are these optimists?" And me, you know. Or as Madeleine Albright used to say, "I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot." So, I'll take that. Yes. No, look, you know, there's democratic renewal, which, as I said, I'll say it again, involves the engagement of everybody. It might mean you have to take time off from work to think more about your community. It might mean that you have to donate some money. It might mean that you need to follow politics more closely than you used to. It might need you need to talk to people around you or in your family or at your workplace to remind them of why these things are important. I mean, there's always something that can be done. And there's always a possibility of revival. I mean, remember, there is no such thing as historical inevitability. Like there's no historical determinism. So there is no rule. I said democracies often fail, but there's no reason why ours has to. There isn't a law of history that says that. Everything that happens tomorrow depends on what we all do today. The future is determined by decisions that are made right now. There isn't like someone up there, pushing it one way or the other. So everybody has some power to influence how things go, and that includes everyone in this room.
Thank you. All right. So my colleague Julian here will come find you with a microphone if you have a question to ask.
And let's keep it to questions rather than statements, please.
Hi, thank you. Hi, thank you so much, Anne. It was a wonderful talk. You said that all democracies eventually falter or fail. Don't all forms of government eventually fall? Okay. So that's reassuring. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I would say that in most of human history, most people have lived in what we would call autocracies, whether they're monarchies or, I don't know, warlords or oligarchs. And it's true that democracy requires a lot of effort on the part of citizens. And democracy has some frailties to it, because it allows a wide range of debate and it allows people to argue in a way that dictatorships don't. It requires some special effort, I would say that.
And should I cancel my Washington Post?
No. I used to write for the Washington Post. There are a lot of great people there, and they're still doing great journalism.
We have one right here.
Thank you for coming out this evening. My question actually is about the Washington Post and the press and what you think about Jeff Bezos' decision to no longer endorse presidential candidates and what that says about the strength or independence of our press.
So first of all, it's legitimate to not want to endorse presidential candidates. Some newspapers don't. Actually, The Atlantic, through most of its history, didn't. We have made an exception for the 3 elections in which Donald Trump was running, and we endorsed his opponent. And we made another exception. Actually, we endorsed Lyndon Johnson because there were similar fears about Barry Goldwater. So that was I think those are Lincoln. We endorsed Lincoln. That's how old The Atlantic is. But most of the time we didn't do it, so the reason not to do it. The thing that was peculiar about this was the last minute nature of it, the fact that the endorsement had already been written, the fact that the owner of the Washington Post has other business interests that he may have perhaps felt would be compromised. And because he's worried, as are a lot of others, about the kind of personalization of government I was talking about. That there would be, that a second Trump presidency would be very different from the first, that Donald Trump would, use the government to take revenge on his enemies or on people who he doesn't like, and that includes the Washington Post, possibly. So certainly that was the appearance of what Bezos did. It made it look like it was a kind of, obeying in advance or kowtowing in advance. And that was why it was so ugly, and that was why the people who I know at the Washington Post were so upset. I used to work there, so just to be clear, that's why I know them. So that's why people were upset, and that's why people have been canceling subscriptions. I'm hoping that the newspaper will recover. I'm worried about it because, nowadays, this has actually always been true, but of course it feels more important now. Why do people believe one news source over another? Why do you read the Washington Post and not, I don't know, the Epoch Times or some, and the answer is because you trust it. You trust that it's, whatever newspaper you read. I'm not telling you have to read the Washington Post, but people, you read something because you trust it, because you believe it's being written in good faith, because everybody makes mistakes, but there are some newspapers that will correct their mistakes, which the Post would do, and others won't. Of course there are always some bad journalists, or there's a columnist you dislike, or whatever. But you have some faith in the leadership of the organization, and I am worried that the Bezos decision may have damaged that, which would be very, very bad for the paper. But it's, as I said, it's still full of people who are committed and dedicated reporters and people who work hard, and I'm hoping it will recover.
Oh, you hold it. Thanks for coming. I'm a graduate student at Villanova, and we were actually assigned Iron Curtain this fall in our Cold War class. So it was a great read. My question is, one thing that you got in that book was the surveillance state of Eastern Europe. And I guess my question for you is, there was an article written earlier this year about post-ops maybe starting to have surveillance of women and their pregnancies and their care. Are you worried about that at all, that a surveillance state might start to creep into our country like we saw in Eastern Europe?
So I'm very worried about the surveillance state. One of the features of modern autocracy, and there's some of it is in the book, is the expansion of surveillance into whole new realms. The Chinese now have systems whereby they not only track what people do online, what they say, but also where they shop, where they travel. You can follow people in a way offline. You can detect where they're using their Metro card or where train tickets they're buying. And if you have sufficiently large and sophisticated systems, and you use AI, you can really follow somebody's entire life. That's now technologically possible. And it is already being abused in many parts of the world, and yes, I'm worried it could be abused here. The idea of tracking women or watching women or monitoring women who, monitoring their pregnancies or their menstrual periods is so horrific that one doesn't even want to contemplate it, but technologically I imagine it's possible. Through all, you could monitor what people's buying habits and you could figure it out from that. Even now, that if you are pregnant, I've had people say to me, it's amazing how, I open up Google and ads for diapers come online. You would be amazed what is already known about you by technology companies and what could be known about the government. Actually, one of my other things I argue in my book is that we should reduce the power of those technology companies, but that's for, again, another hour-long conversation.
We have time for 2 more brief questions. I'm going to go right here.
Thank you. Ukraine is on the ballot this time out, and you have a very unique perspective, not only as an American, but your husband is the foreign minister to Poland. I'd like to hear what polls are saying about the election and what happens to Ukraine after November 5th.
Polls are anxious. There was a moment of celebration you probably didn't even notice, but Harris said, now I can't remember, was it at the convention, was it in her speech at the convention, she said something about the Polish Americans in Pennsylvania, I think it was.
Yes.
Like there was national rejoicing in Poland. Someone cares about us, So they're following it very closely. Look, I can't really deny it. Yes, there is an enormous amount of concern. And the concern is that, in order to defeat what is now clearly an alliance of autocracies, so we now have North Korean troops fighting with the Russians. The Russians are using Iranian missiles, North Korean ammunition. The Chinese are supplying them with components for their defense industry. This is now a very broad effort across the autocratic world to defeat Ukraine. And by the way, one of the reasons they need that effort is that the Russians have been unable to defeat Ukraine so far, thanks to our efforts. But in order to fight back against it, we need some kind of unity in the democratic world. We've had it until now. I believe that Harris is somebody who cares about alliances. She's interested in them. I can't promise you what her policy would be or who she would appoint. I don't know, or what her specific, what specific decisions she would take. But she, again, both in her speech at the convention and in the debate, and several times subsequently, she's talked about America playing a positive role in the world and working with allies, and she's perhaps because she's a former prosecutor, she's also has an attachment to the idea of rule of law and international law. Trump has told us many times that he doesn't like allies. You know, alliances are a burden. He particularly doesn't like Europeans. He has this thing about German cars. He doesn't think they should be sold here. You know, he as president, he wanted to leave the NATO alliance. John Bolton, who was his national security advisor, told me, and this is in my, I've created a podcast called Autocracy in America, 5 parts, you can download it. And one of the interviews that's a part of one of the episodes is a conversation we conducted with John Bolton, who described he was in a car with Donald Trump, and they were going to, I think it was a NATO summit, maybe it was another European summit, and in the car, President Trump turned to him and said, "Okay, John, today we're going to make history, we're going to leave NATO." And, you know, all, you know, hysteria, you know, they got Jim Mattis to call him, they got some other people to call him, some people in the Senate, you know, and convinced him that it would be bad for his poll ratings or something if he left NATO. But I mean, that's not a joke, actually, that is what happened. So it's instinctively something he doesn't understand, he doesn't see the point of. And he's also somebody who's voiced many times, including in the last few days, his admiration for autocrats. He admires Xi Jinping, he admires Putin, he admires Kim Jong-un, which is actually the weirdest one. He admires people who, as I was saying at the beginning, rule without checks and balances. They don't have to worry about the press, they don't have to worry about judges. He admires people like that. That's his instinct. That's been his instinct for 30 years. It's nothing new. And so the fear that he would abandon Ukraine, that there would be that would lead to a broader war in Europe, that other European countries would be attacked or invaded, that the war would spread is very, very strong in Europe, in Poland, but everywhere else. So, I mean, look, for the rest of the world, this is an incredibly consequential and important election. They're all following it. I mean, it's funny. I think Poles know more about American politics than they know about German politics. I mean, it's weird, you know, they're neighbors, but I think it's true of almost every European. Certainly, the British know more about American politics than they know about French politics, and that's definitely true. So, but people follow it because, I mean, some of it is, you know, U.S. power and strength and the size of our army, but it's not just that. It's because the U.S. has played the role, for better and for worse, and of the leader of the democratic world, the moral leader, the practical leader. People listened to the United States. They took a cue from the United States, even when they didn't like the United States. They had to consider it in this role, and they had to react to it. And the idea that the United States would somehow disappear, or it would would no longer play that role, or it would no longer be a country whose democracy was admired, you know, or whose political system was admired, is something that people find very disorienting. You know, it's like losing your pole star, you know, the thing that you guided your ship by. And I think people feel that very strongly in a lot of countries. I've heard even people from countries that aren't democracies, or that or people who aren't fans of the United States, find the idea of the United States disappearing from that role very disorienting.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for more questions. So, but Anne will be able to sign books in the front. So please, let's give our moderator Jordan Wood an hand.
Thank you so much. What a great audience.